So let's just talk about cap and trade. That's one kind of market. People say, let's cap the amount of carbon that can be emitted, and then we'll allow people to trade the cap. And that seems like a market, right? It's kind of like a fishing right. We cap how many fish you can catch, and then we allow you to sell your right to catch fish. And yeah, that can work. It is a kind of market. It's a creation of a property right, because we didn't have property rights to emit carbon. Everybody has, just exhale once, and that proves you have a property right to emit carbon. I start my Ford F-350. That exercises my right to emit carbon. That's a big pickup truck, in case you didn't know. Or people say, well, the problem is the price isn't right. We got the demand and supply, but we just don't have the right price, so we'll put a tax. I don't know which one's the cost and benefit curve here when I have it this way, but we'll put a tax on carbon. It'll raise the cost, and then that'll increase the price of carbon, and we'll have less of it. And those all seem really good. But I want you to go back and go back to my second or third slide there. No, not the graphs, for heaven's sakes. But the one about politics. Yeah, okay. Who gets the cap? And what's the right carbon tax? And I've had some arguments with colleagues here at the Hoover about the carbon tax. And they say, oh, well, we're just going to get the right carbon tax. And if you've had economics, I know you've had a professor draw a diagram and put a per unit tax on the good and show you all the wondrous things that tax can do. And then the proponents of this say, and we'll have it be revenue neutral. So all the revenue we take in, we'll redistribute back. And I always respond to that by, what planet do you live on? First off, show me a tax that's been revenue neutral. Social Security tax? Social Security payments? You'll hear John Cogan in a while. That one isn't quite that way. And that list just goes on. And furthermore, if I had a whiteboard up here, I can draw the graphs and I can put the line up. But what tax? How big should it be? And that's a political issue that's going to make it very difficult, a political issue that's just insurmountable for the most part. Or take cap and trade. Well, let's just cap carbon and then allow trade. Who gets the cap? And how do you define and enforce the cap? Well, I love this. The same with regard to the tax, but I love this quote. I was at a conference down at Santa Barbara, and Jeff Immelt, the then CEO of General Electric, was giving this lecture on the wonders of cap and trade and what a great market this was going to be. And this was early in the Obama administration. President Obama had proposed a cap and trade system and proposed that we sell the cap. And it was going to generate billions of dollars, and this would help with the deficit and so on. And Jeff Immelt said, well, cap and trade's a great idea, but my company, General Electric, has built some of the most efficient jet engines ever. And we've really reduced our carbon footprint with jet engines. And the light bulbs we're making, those little corkscrew things, we invented those, and we should get some of the cap given to us. And I was there at the invitation of one of the editors of the Wall Street Journal who said, throw a few bombs out there once in a while. So I raised my hand and I said, Mr. Immelt, this is great because you have a lot of Washington, D.C. lobbyists who are going to mean you're going to get the cap. But when I was sitting at a table with some Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, I said, what about these poor schmucks? I didn't quite put it that way, but what about these people who don't have lobbyists? And his response was, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And these people were just like, that's the reality of it. The cap and trade is going to be this way. They're political rights, and they're always up for grabs. Let me just touch on this, and then I'm going to end so we can have some discussion. But there are a couple of classic examples of where we've tried cap and trade. One here in the United States, we use sulfur caps to deal with acid rain. So got SO2 in the air, mixes with water, falls to the ground as a form of acid, kills trees and other things. So we put a cap and trade program in. It worked wonderfully until EPA started saying, well, let's just take some cap back. And the owners of cap said, whoa, wait a minute. Now my cap isn't worth very much. It's like saying, well, I'm just going to take 2 bedrooms from your house. The value of your house is going to go down. And all of a sudden, people just abandoned trying to reduce sulfur emissions so they could sell the cap that they own. This is a graph showing what happened with the EU trading program. The European Union created a cap and trade system for carbon, and it seemed to be working pretty well. And so this shows the 2 phases of it. But the prices have fallen of these caps, and the trading market has virtually disappeared. And part of what went on was people who started producing wind energy said, give us some caps. And so the EU said, okay, here are a few more. And then the people who were producing solar energy said, well, we should get some, and here are a few more. Well, if you haven't already, you probably get a lecture on monetary policy. It's the same thing. If you put a bunch of dollars out there, you're probably going to get a reduction in the value of dollars. And that's exactly what happened with the EU trading system. The point here is just the kinds of market-type approaches that are thrown out as a way to deal with global warming and carbon emissions, in particular greenhouse gases, are, I don't think, very politically feasible. If they happen, they will not be aimed at finding the bliss point. And so, if you're so smart, Anderson, what's your solution? And my answer is adaptation. And adaptation is something that we human beings have been good at for a lot of centuries. And I don't think there's any reason to think we won't be pretty good at, even with respect to dealing with climate change. And if you think about what climate change is about, it's really about new risks we haven't thought about. Risks for losing species, risks for sea levels rising, risks for changes in storm patterns, and the list goes on. It's all about risk. And so the question is, well, how might we think, how might markets deal with this risk? And my answer is, and I've been directing a program here at Hoover on adaptation to climate change, and we've looked at land markets, water markets, insurance and bond markets, option markets, and what we find is, indeed, this is happening. Again, plain reading, same Economist magazine. I open it up, and again, I'll be brief, but just read you a little. This is talking about other possible ways of dealing with this that would have saved us lots of money. And they said if this were paid by the owners or their insurers, it might be unobjectionable to do these cheaper things. But insurers and banks are only slowly beginning to capture sea level rise in policies and mortgages. In a world awash with capital eager to build, buy, or develop, prices seldom reflect the long-term threat. Some prices signals are emerging where the problems are the most egregious. Think sea level rise, that's what this whole article is about, and guess what? Miami-Dade, if you look at what's happening to real estate prices, real estate along the coast is still rising slightly, but if you want to invest in real estate, get back away from the coast, higher ground. My house at 5,400 feet, I'm not very worried about climate change and sea level rise. But the point here is, and the Economist is saying it's not happening enough, but here's a market, insurers for one thing, and real estate owners for another, recognize the risk and are trying to incorporate into the way they behave. I mentioned my house at 5,400 feet. We're not going to be inundated by sea level rise, but we have a forest behind our house. And that forest has a lot of dead pine trees left from the pine beetle of a few years back. What do you think I am worried about? I'm worried about wildfire. I'm worried about whether climate change will, and lots of studies look at the impacts, the effects of climate change on potential for wildfire. I'm worried about wildfire. And I'm really worried about it, except for one thing, my house is insured. And that helps a lot. Now, I've cleared the land around my house. Last year, had a bunch of brush moved back several hundred feet from my house. And the fire department tells me I've done all the right things. But how much of the risk do you think is incorporated into my insurance policy? Almost none. Why? Because it hasn't been something that insurers worried about. But you start having water lapping at your ankles or your calves or your knees, and you start to say, maybe there's something to this. And you would expect, and it's happening. We had a conference here last spring with experts on insurance and bond markets. They are beginning to reflect this. Cities that are located along paths where there are more likely to be hurricanes or storm surges are beginning to see their bond rates go up because how are you going to deal with the infrastructure in your city if you know it's going to be wiped out in no time? So the bottom line is that I think markets even have a way. Are they enough? I'm not going to debate that. I'm happy to in the Q&A. But let me just close by saying, why do I come and talk about this now? Why am I so excited about these opportunities? And I think in a way, we picked the low-hanging fruit with regulations. We didn't kill the bald eagle. That was a good idea to pass a law that says we couldn't. But that one was easy. But now it comes to saving some tortoise or some mouse or some minnow, and people are like, come on, do we really need to do this? And the groups that love those tortoises, love those minnows, and put their money where their mouths are finding ways to make it happen, where the regulatory approach is much harder to implement. These are the entrepreneurs. I call them enviropreneurs. They're the people like Hank Fisher who see these new ways. Or, and I use the quotes around finding the ways that work. I know Fred Krupp, the director, I suppose his title is, maybe it's president, of Environmental Defense Fund. And Fred and I were talking one day about, what their motivation is. And Fred's a lawyer. He said, when I went to work for Environmental Defense Fund, our unwritten motto was, sue the bastards. And so we would go to court and say, you're polluting this estuary, you're killing this species, whatever it was, we'll sue them and bring them to their knees. Go to the Environmental Defense website today, and that's what you'll see posted at the top. Finding the ways that work. These are, as I keep repeating, these are not people who just had some epiphany because they came to the Hoover Institution boot camp. They are looking for ways that work, and markets get it done. They may not solve every problem. They may not solve global warming in an instant. But some of the examples, the anecdotes, if you will, have shown that it can work. And really, this is not a totally new idea, and I'll close with this. He's one of my favorite conservationist philosophers, Aldo Leopold. If you haven't read Sand County Almanac, go out and type in Amazon.com, order it, and it'll be at your house. It'll be a great read, guaranteed. Aldo Leopold, writing in the 20s and 30s, was a conservationist ahead of his time, and he wrote this book, Sand County Almanac, about his little cabin in Sand County, Wisconsin. And in that book, he talks about conservation, and he talks about at that time we were doing all these federal programs to subsidize farmers. And he said, this is a disaster for wildlife habitat. We're going to be plowing up land everywhere. And so Leopold said, and I think this captures free market environmentalism, he said conservation is a matter of rewarding people who do good, if you will. That's how you make the environment an asset. Thinking about property rights, how they relate to land, water, air, wildlife, and the various other things that we put under this umbrella of environment is a way that we can take the environment, turn it from a liability, you save it, I get the benefits, into an asset, in which case we both win.